It's just preparing to go live. Okay, perfect. So, hello, Tré, and hello, everybody in the room. So Tré will give you a better introduction than me, but I'll just start by saying he's a creative himself, and he's done a lot of great work in other student unions and for The Guardian. He's a poet, a writer. So yeah, he does a lot. And today he's going to be joining us to talk about Black people in the media industry, particularly the film and television industry. And I hope that anybody who watches this on demand or is joining us today, that you might take away from it something, whether that's a movie to watch or doing some further research, or maybe you'll just learn something that you didn't know before. Today's session is going to be about an hour long, and there'll be room at the end for question and answers. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to you, Tré.
Thank you, Mia. So I'm Tré. As Mia said, I'm a writer and a poet, and I'm going to be talking today about Black people in the media. So as a Black creative and a practitioner, I would like to say that as Hertfordshire are basically embodying a tradition here that's not always been accessible to Black people in the arts industry and society more generally, even more so now with the arts under attack, both from coronavirus and seemingly from the government as well. But my interest in performing arts has been solid as far back as I can remember, from when I went to drama club on a Saturday afternoon as a child to when I was a teenager and doing AS film studies as part of my A-levels. And now more recently writing reviews for local publications in my home county of Northamptonshire, or even blogging on diversity and representation on specifically historical dramas. Despite being early career, at only 25 years old, I have done quite a bit. And that's before I talk about my activities as a poet, but that is for another time. This session is called Black Film is Not a Genre, but I'll also be discussing Black creatives in the media industry and TV industry as well. I don't think I need to make the case that 2020 has been a year of change in everyone's lives. The impact of COVID on the film and TV industry has been devastating, but it has allowed me to reflect on this issue of representation. In lockdown, I've been given the time to watch a lot of films that I would not have had time to watch otherwise, pre-pandemic. On the death of British film giant Earl Cameron, I watched Pool of London, which I first saw mentioned in the BBC documentary series Black Hollywood, They Gotta Have Us, a film released in 1951 that shows a Black character in Britain more or less-ish outside of the frames of race and racism. A character that is a man first and many more things second before his race is even mentioned. A character that sits outside of the tropes of today, that Black characters in films that are not about race are still to some extent racialized. I also watched the 1961 film, British film, Flame in the Streets, also co-starring Earl Cameron, and it was nominated for the BAFTA for Best British Screenplay in its day. It is truly a story that encompasses the racial tension that took place following the arrival of the Windrush generation in 1948, all the way up to the 1960s. A racial tension that manifested itself at home, at work, and on the streets during bonfire night, as it does in the film. At the same time, the main character, trade union leader Jacko Palmer, played by John Mills, fights for the rights of a Black worker, simultaneously finding the news troubling that his daughter is in a interracial relationship, planning to marry a West Indian. In light of George Floyd, Black creatives and practitioners have really been pulling their weight, from Diversity's Black Lives Matter inspired dance routine on Britain's Got Talent to David Olusoga's McTaggart lecture and his documentary, Africa Turns the Page. In addition to Afua Hirsch's African Renaissance, When Art Meets Power, and her documentary series with Samuel Jackson, Enslaved. In the US, protesters have also taken to the streets as Hollywood also came to a standstill. However, the recognition of Black actors in film and television has been again hard won. There was once a time when interracial romance was forbidden in Hollywood films under the Hays Code. The Hays Code explicitly banned depictions of sexual relationships between white and Black races in Hollywood film. In my view, institutional use of legislation to uphold Southern sensibilities, a tool of white supremacy, even in the film industry. Further backed by anti-miscegenation laws up to at least the 1960s with Loving versus Virginia. The silent film era occasionally featured interracial relationships to simply criticize them. For example, D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation, which has often been donned as the film responsible for the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. But many of my film frames of reference growing up were American, from Sidney Poitier in classics like In the Heat of the Night and To Sir with Love, to Hattie McDaniel in Gone with the Wind. McDaniel becoming the first Black actor to win an Oscar in 1940 for the role of Mammy. McDaniel is undoubtedly a trailblazer, as was Sidney Poitier, allowing the floodgates to be opened in Hollywood for more Black actors from both sides of the Atlantic, making entry for people like Diane Carroll, Pam Grier, Denzel Washington, James L. Jones, Letitia Wright, Lawrence Fishburne, Daniel Kaluuya, Lena Waithe, and John Boyega, and many others. Each generation makes it a little easier for the next one, but each generation is still fighting racism in the industry in both Britain and the US. Black Lives Matter should show Hollywood and the British film and TV industry that something needs to change. Ofcom, receiving in excess of 20,000 complaints about Diversity's dance performance, tell us that racism is not just a few bad apples. And on March the 24th, just before the UK went into lockdown, conveniently, Disney Plus went live in the UK. The streaming world has not been the same since. Yet despite this very brief history of Black actors, and by extension creatives being blocked from creating their own stories until really the 1970s, and even then only under white leadership, the cataclysmic event in 2020 was the callous and remorseless murder of George Floyd. 8 minutes and 46 seconds, police officer Derek Chauvin knelt on his neck. A Minneapolis police officer held his boot print as the whole world watched, and the response was the biggest anti-racist demonstration in history. But in Britain, we have had race-related reports going back to the 1980s, with Lord Scarman's Brixton Disorders, his investigation into the Brixton riots. We've had the Macpherson Report, also known as the Stephen Lawrence Inquiry, into the London Met's investigation into the murder of London teenager Stephen Lawrence by white racist thugs. We've had the McGregor-Smith Review into race at work, and the Lammy Review into racial disparities in the criminal justice system, and the Angelini Review into deaths and serious incidents in police custody. And most recently, Windrush Lessons Learned by Wendy Williams into the Windrush scandal. One could argue that these documents, albeit not made by Black artists, were indicative of the violence that happen against Black people in the industry too. Racism is violence. In the US, we have filmmakers like Ava DuVernay speaking truth to power through films like Selma and TV shows like When They See Us, telling the story of the Central Park Five. Her documentary 13th shows the patterned racial injustice from American slave plantations and the transitions of power, how systems change but the victims don't. From slave plantations to sharecropping convict leasing, Jim Crow laws, the war on drugs, and now recently with mass incarceration and the prison industrial complex. Other excellent filmmakers like Spike Lee and Barry Jenkins are telling these stories, and Spike Lee has been doing so since the 80s. Amo Asante, the British filmmaker Amo Asante, through Belle and a United Kingdom, tells stories about Black British history, the history we don't learn at school. And in her film Where Hands Touch, there is a story, though semi-fictional, that would force audiences to do their own research on the Afro-Germans that were murdered during the Holocaust. Amo Asante has been breaking glass ceiling after glass ceiling, and her episode of Mrs. America was really fabulous. Black Lives Matter and the coronavirus pandemic have forced conversations I do not think I would see this side of 40 years old. Conversations that have been put off since my parents were growing up in the 70s and 80s in Britain. People like my parents that remember the Brixton riots, and my grandparents that remember the Mangrove 9, which has recently been depicted in small acts by Black British filmmaker Steve McQueen. 2020 has been a year of ongoing hard conversations of not only how Black people are disproportionately impacted by stop and search and tasering in the UK, but how Black Lives Matter stopped being about police years ago, and how Black Lives Matter can just as well say Black voices matter in the film and TV industry, both in front and behind the camera, where representation behind the camera is much worse than it is in front of it. So even though we are getting more period dramas featuring Black characters, shows like The Spanish Princess, featuring the Black Tudors, for example, or shows like World on Fire, featuring Black soldiers and interracial relationships during the Second World War, these shows are still written by white people. Many period dramas behind the camera are still really white, and despite the plethora of books on Black history by Black historians and by Black journalists, writing a history that goes back to Roman times, the British TV and film industry behind the camera is still incredibly white. Very much so that with the historical drama, despite Black and brown characters in Sanditon, Vanity Fair, and Les Mis, these characters are not all being written by people of colour. And this representation is even worse when you look to senior leadership teams in production companies. And yet, whilst I'm talking about Black creatives, there is an intersectionality here that I'm sure impacts gender, age, sexuality, disability, class, and so on. While I have not directly worked in the industry, I'm someone that writes regularly and reviews film and television, and above all, someone that is passionate about film and TV and storytelling, doing my first degree in creative writing. My colleagues that do work in the industry or have done tell me about scenarios where they have been stereotyped and marginalized and really felt the joy of what they do sap from beneath them. The documentary Black Hollywood was a reminder that despite all these excellent and sometimes tear-jerking stories coming out of the film and TV industry on both sides of the Atlantic, these Black artists and innovators are still subject to the institutionalized racist practices that I've seen in academia, that George Floyd, Breonna Taylor experienced when they were murdered by police with no justice in sight. I have not seen race debated like this in my lifetime, even amidst the London riots where Mark Duggan was killed by London Metropolitan Police in 2011. In June 2020, Rennie Edo-Lodge became the first Black British author to top the non-fiction book chart, and 5 of the best-selling books in Britain at that time were on race or Black history. Since George Floyd, whose name I fear will grow to have an almost mythos meaning, in the same vein as Stephen Lawrence or Emmett Till, or even the tragic Grenfell, institutions have started to reevaluate themselves, some more critically than others. Yet within this movement, I found it troubling that the texts to dominate reading and watch lists are overwhelmingly tied to Black trauma, the trauma narrative, slavery and police violence, and those texts may well be interesting, but there are more to Black lives than reacting to trauma, and we need to remember those stories too. love, joy, and hope, the things that all people can feel. And in the films we watch in response to Black Lives Matter, we need to be engaging in these stories as well. Films like Stephen Riley's documentary Fire in Babylon, that not only showed how the West Indies cricket team defeated racism on the field of play, but also showed how black men as something other than violent, colonial stereotypes. Films like To Sir with Love and Queen of Catway, showing black men as self-sacrificing father figures. Films like the 1974 film Claudine, that does, I admit, play into the stereotypes of the welfare queen, but it also shows a version of the black family, um, a black working class family that isn't insulting to the working class. It shows a family that is somewhat content in their working class origins, and there's a degree of pride in their working class identity. Stories that lift black people up and celebrate their achievements, not only depicting their trauma. The industry in Britain has shown to be investigating itself inwardly, some in regards to policy and practice, others with focuses on diversity and inclusion in response to Black Lives Matter. Improvements to how the industry operates have been promised, but we all know how much the words of institutions can be worth. There have been promises before that have been broken. I'm cautiously optimistic. I live in hope. In his McTaggart lecture, Professor David Olusoga said other institutions have faced up to their historic roles in slavery or imperialism. How we tell these stories and the cultures of these productions have also been debated, including the use of the N-word by historian Lucy Worsley on a documentary programme which faced backlash from audiences. Moreover, in his lecture, he says, in 2016, Directors UK reported 2.22% of TV programmes were made by BAME directors, and of the directors on their dataset, just 3.6% were BAME, which means even though the industry has long claimed to be crying out for Black producers and directors, many of those already in the industry were not getting work. Okay. And just like what is happening across society, including in my background in education, what about retention? What about retention rates? It's one thing being able to hire Black creatives and practitioners, but how can we keep them? As someone that loves history and historical dramas, October 2016 was a huge time for me. Black History Month. When the BBC did their Black and British season, this was the first time I saw a Black historian on mainstream television. I was shocked. The BBC, which for years had been criticised for being BBC so white, and this Black man was centering Black history. I was overjoyed. Despite Professor David Olusoga coming from a mixed race background, he looked like me, and was in a profession that I've a deep interest in as well. Someone that was a historian, but he was also a filmmaker, and is now in academia and education. Whilst I can rattle off a number of Black historians in academia today, what I can't do is give you a list of Black historians that have presented documentaries on the BBC. David Olusoga is really the only one I know of, unsurprisingly when history as a subject is very white and also very male. As I mentioned earlier, I also do poetry. In Northamptonshire, I am the diversity in those circles more often than not, and despite Black writers making waves across the country, in addition to, but not only because of Black Lives Matter, in my vicinity, I am one of the few writers of my colour. Yet in Northamptonshire, is that reflective of the community? Not a chance. When we want to improve diversity in education or journalism or even film and television, this is really just double talk for trying to eradicate racism. The lack of racial diversity and inclusion across society's institutions is systemic racism, systemic inequality. When we can count the number of Black professors at UK universities, you know there is a problem. When Black women are still becoming the first of their colour to achieve things, we know there's racism and misogyny, or systemic misogynoir, as I would call it. Now I am 25 years old and can rattle off a list of actors, writers, and directors I would call role models to today's up-and-coming Black youth. From David Olusoga to Mary Blackman, John Boyega, Lena Waithe, Barry Jenkins, and more. When my parents were growing up, that wasn't as easy. When my grandparents were growing up, and younger, certainly not. As in the 50s and the 60s, there was Sidney Poitier and Harry Belafonte. I believe I deliver this talk today as someone that was told by teachers growing up that Black people were not creative, that I could not be a teacher or an academic, and I was better off setting my sights a little lower. I see this as patterned behaviour, as my parents' generation were also told similar things. And this is how things become normalised and endemic. And then you have generations of Black people choose not to aspire because you can't be what you can't see. And then you have a cycle, and it goes on and it goes on and on. Systemic racism, diversity, inclusion, representation, it's all linked up together. And there's history. As Black history is still not included on the national curriculum and in institutionalised form, white writers of historical dramas are starting to write these characters into their work. When this happens, the torrent of racism from fandom can often be overwhelming. As someone that engages with the period drama fandom online, when Black and brown fans of these shows defend the choices of white writers, we are also met with racist abuse. Because the histories these shows often perpetuate in their choosing to do diversity runs counter to what many of us were taught at school. The inclusion of Kitty Despard in season 5 of Poldark, for example, one of the many members of the Black Georgians, that is not something that I learned at school. The contributions of not just Black people, but ethnic minorities more widely to Britain is not something that is taught, not how the Jews and the Irish kicked Oswald Mosley out of Cable Street, not the stories of refugees and immigrants, and that is a history that goes back centuries. When these stories are included in these shows, we get people like Lawrence Fox contesting the existence of a Sikh soldier in Sam Mendes's 1917, which would have been historically accurate. Over 4 million non-white, non-British servicemen took part in the First World War from the African and Asian continents, as well as the USA and the Caribbean. And the film and TV industry is starting to tell those stories of Black Britain a little bit at a time. The pulling down of the Edward Colston statue was divisive, and that opened a national conversation on slavery. Albeit written by a white guy, BBC's Anthony was on the murder of Anthony Walker. This is also part of this history, of this representation. The ITV shorts on racism in Britain, Channel 4's The School That Tried to End Racism too. That while this talk is a meandering monologue on Black creatives, meaning filmmakers and screenwriters as well, and media more generally, we also need to look at the stories Black people are centering now in their own lives as members of their communities. That in the UK's divide between being woke and being Tory, are we truly being the best neighbours to our Black friends and colleagues? That whilst many Black creatives have left the industry in what David Olusoga called the lost generation, many Black British actors have also left the UK industry for Hollywood, the US, a place Britain so often criticised for being more racist than the UK, as if it's a competition. However, America is very open with its racism. Britain likes to play games, though recently that can also be contested. We are losing talent in Britain for our inability to change. We are losing talent, and that's as not too long ago, a BBC newsroom in Bristol thought it was okay for a reporter to say the N-word in a news report. Diversity in the media means we will have fewer incidents like that. Diversity in film means that we will have more stories that centre these communities, which means the consciousness of the population at large will be elevated, as there will be a more authentic voice through stories commissioned by the BBC, ITV, and so forth, that tackle race and the contributions ethnic minorities have made and continue to make for the benefit of the UK. Black creatives should not be pigeonholed to only writing about race, but their presence in the writers' rooms will certainly reduce these incidents. If there are Black writers in the script writing process for shows like Little Britain, for example, would we be seeing news stories on their use of blackface? Growing up, I was told you've got to work twice as hard for half as much, and now I'm realizing that my parents were right when they said that. My upbringing prepared me as much as it could for the mechanisms of being Black in society, regardless of what industry I chose to go into. At that moment, that industry is education as a freelancer. From the number of high earning institutions that have offered me unpaid exposure to do talks, to the assumption that I do not know my area, which I'm inclined to believe is because of the ingrained stereotypes in society of Black people, the microaggressions, it's death by 1,000 cuts. And I truly hope the Black Lives Matter movement in Britain has provoked the film and TV industry to take these issues a bit more seriously. Last year, when I was a sabbatical officer at my students' union, I went to a talk at my university, delivered by a mixed race reporter from the BBC. I asked whether him ticking diversity quotas was his ticket into the BBC, or was it his Cambridge education, as he had told us earlier that he went to Cambridge, or if he believed he got in on his own merits. You could say he was quite shocked by the question. Dare I say offended. Hearing David Olusoga talk about this lottery of privilege with the BBC and red brick universities did not surprise me, particularly Oxford and Cambridge. TV's lack of diversity is as much an issue in journalism as it is in TV productions, very much so behind the camera. In her essay, Rocking the Boat, Women of Colour as Diversity Workers, the academic Sarah Ahmed wrote, diversity often creates a happy impression. It is how an organisation appears, welcoming to those who appear different, by drawing on those who appear different. Diversity can appear as an invitation, an open door, translated into a minority's welcome. Come in, come in. This is no more evident than in the illusions that film and TV professionals talk about in terms of diversity within the industry, very much so in regards to race. Like across society, TV and film is no different in its acceptance of allowing Black people as performers and frontline workers, but not as leaders in senior leadership teams. So evident in the disparities between the BAFTA TV Awards and the Craft Awards, irrespective of industry, I hear stories about Black people not being listened to. From my point of view, one of the most irritating things of talking about film and TV is particularly now, even more so in period drama circles, is the colourblind approach and how it's not about race. Because being the only Black person or person of colour in those conversations is quite lonely. When everyone else is white with English as their first language, they will not go into those conversations having a lived experience, having lived their life reacting to racism, both the overt and the institutional, very much an alternate plane of existence. Often being the only Black person in those conversations means I'm regularly the only one asking how in a Victorian set drama, the writers seemingly forget to mention colonialism at any point, as if colonialism ceased to exist after slavery ended. One is also the only person asking questions about certain scenes in period dramas, i.e. the pineapple in Sanditon, in relation to West Indian character Miss Lamb. Sanditon is an ITV adaptation of Jane Austen's Sanditon, an unfinished manuscript, and the last thing she wrote before she died in 1817. It features a Black West Indian character called Georgiana Lamb, set in Regency era England, played by Crystal Clark. She is not just a side character playing into the Black best friend stereotype, but is a West Indian heiress in one of the lead roles. The show also explores the complications of being Black in that period, in that era of England, which is well depicted in the second episode when Lady Denham, played by Anne Reid, holds a dinner party in honour of Georgiana. Here, Lady Denham elects to make a pineapple as the centrepiece and the theme of the party. This is very much linked to colonial history and the meaning and connotations of the pineapple fruit, including the exoticization of these fruits and by extension Black bodies, especially Black women. This whole encounter ties into misogynoir, first coined by Black queer feminist scholar Moya Bailey in 2010. Denham's motivation to throw the party is not to honour Miss Lamb, but to get her nephew to marry a rich heiress. The audience are reminded that Georgiana is viewed as a prize, not a person, for her nephew to hunt down like an animal. The colonial connotations are evident, and the writers here know that. Do programs that feature slavery, the Black Tudors, and so forth get advice from Black historians or experts in their field? More often than not, no. They often get a white historian, that is, an expert from an industry that is famously white, knowing full well that there are Black historians that could give more of a nuanced approach as well to those subjects, as that is both their vocation and may well in some cases be their family history. The exclusions of Black and brown experts ties into the epistemological racism, academic racism, that white people are on the inside of reason and Black and brown people are on the outside. That is not to say that people that look like me and my friends and my family are better or more deserving, but it must be said that historically and in the contemporary, people that look like me with the same effort as our white colleagues have often been treated as less deserving. We can be just as critical as our white colleagues, but knowledge has often been treated as something only white people have. That while I'm not a filmmaker or in that specific circle, I'm an audience member and can relate to being in the minority of one. If you are Black in Britain, you will have experienced this multiple times in your life, or you will. Fighting lots of battles alone and feeling this drip feeling of racism taking its toll. Death by 1,000 cuts. They will not fire you for asking questions, but the ominous they will leave you to fight until you have no energy left, and then you quit of your own accord. You'll be called difficult and hard to work with, simply for asking questions or looking at problems from a different point of view. When you are around white people who do not always understand the sensitivities of race or the dangers of reinforcing racist stereotypes, one of the most evident being in big franchises like the James Bond films from the 70s and 80s. One of the most famous in that franchise being Live and Let Die. Ideas of being voodoo or exotic and that sort of thing. I've been labelled too angry, an angry Black person, too political, too emotional. This creates a culture of Black people having to code switch and police their language and behaviours that their white co-workers don't have to. Essentially, not being allowed to have opinions on anything too pushy, too political, too likely to cause upset. Nothing that challenges anything. Be compliant. Be okay with everything. My experiences were not in film, were not in the film industry, but are common across all of society, for Black and brown people across all sectors, including film and television. There are so many initiatives to get Black people of colour into the industry. Now more are asking questions that the problem is the industry. What needs to change is the industry. One of the biggest statements to come out of the Black Lives Matter is silence is compliance. And it's this compliant behaviour that creates institutionally racist organisations. The murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor has forced a conversation across all of society, including film and television, on how we can combat racism and how it is not a task people of colour can achieve by themselves. In an institutional will to bring more Black and brown people into their ranks, like structures including the BBC, they need to change the way they work to accommodate communities that have historically been failed by them. Where is the will for them to change without the reliance on people of colour to do anti-racism work and to be the anti-racists? Decades of abusing Black and ethnic minority talent has led to community distrust in these institutions, a legacy that will take generations to fix, from policing to journalism to film and television and education. These issues are not helped by the fact ethnic minorities are still violently stopped and searched by police, for example, and how despite some diversity in front of the camera, writers and filmmakers still reinforce stereotypes of Black and brown people, greenlit by senior leadership teams. I think there is some cause to be optimistic though. BLM, linked with the coronavirus pandemic, has made what some are calling a perfect storm. Every time institutions make a mistake, there's little room for escape or play games. Every mistake that's made, institutions are made to pay. Additionally, this new generation of activists, those born between 1990 and 2000, now coming into themselves, are more critical than their parents' generation and of their parents. And whilst there was more determination from institutions to do better, this generation is uncompromising in its approach to discussing racism and dealing with racists. Young people have generally have the energy to deal with this issue, but their parents and grandparents' generation need to be there to support them as well, with the lived historical experiences and knowledge, not just in film, TV, and other creative industries, but across all of society. 2020 has been a year of change with both the pandemic and Black Lives Matter, but also changes in government. What's more, the teens of today and the 20-somethings are repulsed by racism and are willing to do whatever it takes to seek change and dismantle inequality. Whether we're tackling racism, classism, the climate crisis, and so on, young people are using their tools at their disposal in ways that the powers that be will one day call devastating or radical. These anti-racist movements will disfigure families, as today's generation are quite happy to disown racist family members that don't want to change, parents that defend racism in racist police officers, grandparents that are also homophobic, transphobic, and practice xenophobia. Young people across society see silence and compliance as complicity. That is the message of Black Lives Matter. The generation leading this has the power to hold institutions like Ofcom to account on systemic issues and shift the narrative. How we tell stories and what stories are being told is sacred and important to how Black people are seen around the world. Global audiences didn't take the civil rights movement seriously until it was broadcast on television. I would argue that my generation spent more time watching Netflix and Disney Plus than dramas on the BBC. So I'd like to ask what Netflix are doing and what are Disney doing to push the race equality agenda. These young people today are a generation that are yet to be convinced that many institutions are working for them, not against them, and really need to be convinced of the usefulness institutions like the BBC have in their lives when they are using institutions like Instagram in ways their parents are in shock of and in awe of. In an era where there are children with YouTube channels making thousands, if not millions of pounds, telling their truths, what significance do these historical broadcast corporations have in the 21st century? With or without the support of white institutions, Black creatives, like screenwriters, directors, and TV makers, will continue to create, innovate, and use their art as tools of resistance, and in many cases, tools of education in their communities. Great artists like Michaela Cowell, David Oyelowo, Amo Asante, Destiny Akaraga, Ava DuVernay, and so many more, and the white writers that tell stories about Black history will assist in this fight. Young people will not put up with the nonsense of racism. They are creative, and social media changed everything. And since Black Lives Matter does not seem to be going away anytime soon, Black artists in the industry will continue to use their space to speak, to show Black people in all facets of their humanity. Thank you. Me, you're on mute.
Of course I am. That's so typical. I was just saying how thought-provoking you are every time. That's
Thank you.
I've had you, and yeah, you had me at every word. Like talking about the Hays Code.
Yeah.
I didn't know. I've never heard of it before. It's really interesting.
Some of the institutions, like it's like institutional use of the law to strip people of their rights. I mean, race is just one aspect. You can look at it, look what they did with workers, like Thatcherism and the miners' strikes, and all the stuff that happened before that as well, in terms of working and unionizing and the trade unions. So yeah, I think the law has been used devastatingly in history, and that's just the Hayes Code is just one example of it, I think.
And you know, it wasn't even that long ago that those things were happening.
Yeah.
It's also great that everything you've just spoke about we could probably access in, you know, a couple clicks. So
Yeah.
yeah, we're fortunate. I do have a couple of questions for you.
Okay.
One being, you were talking about Sanditon.
Mm.
And how do you think Black people were seen and portrayed during that kind of time period from the 18th to 19th century?
I think when it comes to racism in its infancy, so when it sort of was, because race doesn't exist, it's a social construct, and specifically anti-Black racism, at least in part, it came out of enslavement and slavery, but a lot of it was scientific. It was a lot of it was created by medical scholars, and anthropologists and that sort of stuff. So the idea that Black people run fast and that sort of stuff, those sorts of stereotypes, it's very scientifically based, and a lot of these ideas were perpetuated back then, as scientific fact. And when you read a lot of books from that era, especially the 19th century, stuff like say Heart of Darkness, Joseph Conrad, that's early 20th century, but even before that, H.G. Wells, Vanity Fair, Jane Austen, a lot of those books, they perpetuated these ideas of Western is great and non-Western is not.
Yeah.
So Black people were seen as part of non-Western, and they would have been treated as such in society. And these ideologies it was in the media. I mean, you look at the world now, and how the media talks about immigrants and refugees and that sort of stuff, and how I think it was a couple of years ago there was a big backlash to Katie Hopkins, and she called some refugees, she called them cockroaches, I think, and that was the term she said. Yeah. And you look at the stuff happened back in the Victorian times. You look at some of the stuff that they used to say about Black people then, and you compare it to the now, and some of the stuff, like, it's not age to day, some of it, to be honest. So when there's Black people walking down the street back then, many of them would have been racially discriminated against, if they were slaves or not. Racism was a factor in that society because of the literature that was being created, and many of it was academically based. So universities were one of the biggest justifiers of racism, and it's in thanks to universities that the slave trade, they made intellectual justifications for the subjugation of Black people, which essentially made justifications for the slave trade. So yeah, how they were treated in that time it's awful. So someone like Georgiana Lamb, despite being having rank and having a high status socially, she's still a Black woman and would have been treated as such in that time, in proximity to her race, and probably to her gender as well, to some extent.
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, a lot of it is really awful, but I guess that's why you talk about things like decolonizing the curriculum, you know, all of those kind of bits. Another question for you. What would you like to see in terms of creating a fairer representation for Black people and ethnic minorities from media outlets? Or
I think the stories we tell have consequences. So I think it's just choosing. Oh, I like to see more stories about racism um, from the perspective of people of color, but I'd also like to see more stories not about racism by people of color at the same time. Um, just stories about nothing.
Yeah.
Because white people can have stuff like Love Actually, which is just about nothing, essentially. And I think that's the point that many people want to get to, where a black cast can be in a film like that and it not be about race.
Yeah.
And I think I'm told Jingle Jangle on Netflix is sort of getting to that point where that sort of stuff is normalized. So I think that's one thing I'd like to see, like just more stories featuring people of color that aren't about racism, just about nothing, just about living.
Yeah. No.
Yeah. Yeah.
So like for Black History Month, you mentioned before, like a lot of black creatives get hired over Black History Month.
Yeah.
Where are they for the rest of the year?
Mm.
And that's kind of where a lot of problems are, I guess. One last question for you. What 3 films would you recommend to our audience?
Well, the ones I mentioned in the talk, I think I would recommend looking at more British cinema in general. Not just the new stuff with Amo Sante and Destiny Carragher and that, but going back through the catalogue and looking at films from the 60s and the 50s, because many of them do have black actors in them. So what we're doing, saying about representation now and diversity, some filmmakers were doing that in the 50s, despite the conventions of racism at the time. So I'd say look at more British cinema. So I'll look at Paul of London, the one that I mentioned in the talk. More recently, I watched Steve McQueen's Mangrove last week, and I think that's the best film of the year. It's the best film I've watched this year, to be honest.
Mangroves, did you say?
Yeah, it's called Mangrove, about the Mangrove 9 trial, I think it's 1970 it happened. Members of which would now be called the Windrush generation, basically put race relations into a public sphere. So we would not have things like the Stephen Lawrence inquiry and the report that came out of it without the Mangrove 9 first putting that discourse into a public arena. So I think Mangrove is probably one of the other films I'd say look at. And Barry Jenkins as well. Probably Barry Jenkins is If Beale Street Could Talk. So when I talked about black people being in films about just life in general, I think If Beale Street Could Talk is one of those films, because it does feature police brutality, but it also shows a black working class family and a black middle class family just being families and just arguing about family stuff. And I think that's probably one of the best films of I think it was last year it came out. It's an adaptation of a James Baldwin novel, and the book is good as well. So yeah, If Beale Street Could Talk, Mangrove, and Paul of London. Yeah.
Cool, thank you. So if anyone has any last questions, just pop them in. But it doesn't look like anyone does. I think we'll wrap it up there, Tré.
Okay.
But it's been really great having you again.
Thank you.
We'll see you again in the future.
Yeah.
Thank you.